Welcome to Sustainable Stock. Real conversations about cattle, land, and the culture that surrounds them. From grazing and management to the weight of stewardship that cattlemen carry, we explore what truly sustains the herd. Brought to you by Boss Sires Genetics, functional, fertile, adapted genetics. Here's your host, Patrick Powers.
Well, welcome back for another episode of Sustainable Stock. Today I'm joined by Mr. Johann Zietsman, and we're here to talk some cattle. Mr. Zietsman, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Patrick.
Yes, sir. Well, I wanted to welcome you on, and for those that aren't very familiar with your work or who you are, I wonder if you could give us a quick rundown on where you're at in the world and your involvement in this world of cattle.
Okay, well, I'll just give a quick background. I'll start with where I am at the moment. At the moment, I'm in Zambia. I'm immigrated to Zambia from Zimbabwe. Because of the land seizures there, I had to start anew. I'm actually a third generation Zimbabwean. My parents came up from, my grandparents came up from South Africa more than a century ago, and our family's been involved in ranching since then. Since childhood, I've been very interested in cattle, growing up in a cattle ranch, and my uncles were also rearing cattle. Between my father and his two brothers, we were rearing 10,000 head of cattle. So I think I can speak from a bit of experience in that sense. And I've always been interested, as I say, in two things, really. One is to breed felt or grass-adapted cattle, and the other one was to use those cattle to improve the land. And I
Yes,
was
sir.
fortunate in that I did a degree under Professor Jan Bonsma at the University of Pretoria. But more important than that, I was able to go ranching myself. And that's really where my education started. So I have a background, academic background, and I have a practical background. And the big breakthrough for me came in 1995, 12th of January, in fact, is when I started grazing cattle at very high densities. Going on from the work of Alan Savory, and also people in South Africa who started non-selective grazing, but at low stock densities because of the conventional fencing. And I was able to make a breakthrough in 12th of January 1995 using electric fences to graze cattle at very high stock densities. And I immediately was able to double my stocking rate because of better utilization of grazing on what we call sow-felt poor quality grazing, where animals are normally grazed selectively. And then after 7 years, I was able to carry 4 times the number of cattle. But at that stage, after 7 years of grazing non-selectively, I had to vacate my farm because of political unrest, and that's when I started consulting over the world. I did a lot of consulting in the United States and in South America. And currently, I'm in Zambia and enjoying being in this part of the world.
That's wonderful. Well, diving right into it, you noted the use of a practical background. Just how important would you say that is in cattle operations?
Extremely important, because what the academics say and what happens on the ground is two very different things. So I would say it's extremely important and that is where I had a head start. I had an academic background, but I saw that things on the ground weren't always working out as it should, and that's where I think my biggest breakthrough came was being able to do it practically.
Okay. Well, to take that a step further, where would you say some of the disconnect between science and practicality is? If we were to name a couple key points.
Uh, obviously one is on the grazing side, because the range scientists, in generally speaking, people attribute cattle in a negative sense in terms of grazing management, and because they haven't found the niche, or where cattle and grass have a mutually beneficial effect on each other if you graze them correctly. They assume that cattle have a negative effect on grazing, and that's why they kept cattle numbers low. And that is where the big breakthrough came. Looking at the work of Alan Savory and other people in South Africa, and which, from an academic point of view, just didn't make sense, because cattle, uh, conventionally speaking, most people have a goal of maximum production per animal, whereas I believe that we have to have a goal of maximum sustainable profit per hectare. And the two are, breeding and management practices for either are very, very different.
Yes, sir. And I imagine that high stocking density stands in opposition to a lot of academia as well in that regard.
Absolutely, because they graze, you're forcing cattle to graze non-selectively. So individually, the performance will be lower. But because you're carrying a lot more cattle and you're improving the land, your profit per hectare is much higher.
Excellent. Well, there's another element there that you've stated in other conversations, and that's the natural conditions versus a structured, a false condition set. Where do you think that that study falls short in that regard?
Could you just repeat that question, Patrick? I'm not quite sure whether I understand you correctly.
Yes, sir. The influence that the natural world and its laws has on these fields of research.
Yes.
There's a I feel that there's a separation when it comes to that classroom environment or that scientific environment, that we don't respect all these outside forces. And you've spoke on that previously. I
Yes,
was
I think
wondering if
that,
we could.
yeah, the main reason for that is because of the different goal. Because academically speaking and conventionally speaking, people have a goal of maximum production per animal. So the more selectively those animals can graze, and in terms of selection, the larger animals have a greater production per animal. Whereas if your goal is maximum sustainable, ecologically and economically sustainable profit per hectare, it's a different world. The practices of breeding and management practices are very different. And that's where the
Yes, sir.
disconnect comes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, shifting a little more broadly and getting out of the profit per hectare conversation that I definitely want to dive further into later. Let's shift our focus more towards the global cow herd. You said a lot of this information came about to you in the early 90s. Is that correct?
I would say
Or you started forming these ideas around that time?
well, I started forming them in my teenage years in the
Oh,
1960s. Yeah, that's
I
when I started.
apologize.
No, that's where I
Okay.
started. But I was never able
Okay.
to put that into practice until the early 90s, yes. In
Excellent.
1995 is actually where the big breakthrough for me came. Prior to that, I understood that we had to breed grass or felt adapted cattle differently, but I wasn't able to put the practice into practice, the grazing management side, because the bigger problem was we couldn't, practically speaking, under conventional terms with conventional fencing, we could never go to the stock densities required, which is the equivalent of 2,000 paddocks per herd. Stock densities of 2, 3, 4, 5,000 animals per hectare. That's a density of one animal to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 square meters. That is practically wasn't possible until we used a very simple method, which is electric fencing, portable electric fencing.
Well,
So
I apologize for putting those time restraints on you.
no,
That's
not a
my
problem.
lack of knowledge.
No, no, it's not a problem
Well,
at all. So that's where the breakthrough came.
all right. Well, I stated that to push us back a little bit. Where would you say that the global cow herd has shifted in the last 40 or 50 years? Has there been a shift in one direction over another?
Well, it's been up and down. In the late 1960s, people were starting to breed cattle, larger frame cattle, in response to what the feedlots required. Later maturing cattle that don't put on fat on grass, and they wanted to put on fat in the feedlot. That's where the big shift came. And so what were doing then was we were breeding cattle that required better nutrition in order to be productive. And in terms of performance testing as well, particularly what Jan Bonsma was advocating, we were selecting cattle that could be productive, but they required better nutrition. So what we missed was inherent body condition, a combination of inherent body condition, animals that have a higher relative intake, and that favors the smaller framed animal. And in those years, we were selecting animals with larger frames, so they required better nutrition. And apart from that, the larger framed animals also were sexually later maturing. So we had a combination of poor body condition, because of a poor inherent body condition, and also because of an hormonal imbalance, and that was affecting fertility in a very negative way. So that's where it came. But what has changed since then is not much has changed. We still selecting cattle for performance, higher performance, individual performance, and to get higher individual performance, it has a negative effect on, genetically speaking, in terms of inherent body condition, smaller frame, and also larger frame has a negative influence on hormonal balance, maturity, sexual maturity. So those
Yes, sir.
combination of those two, that's where the problem lies.
Alrighty. Well, if we were to have a true return to grass efficiency, would we find our way out of a lot of these problems?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If we selected for grass efficient cattle, then it would be a win-win for everyone, even the feedlots. What we require, if they require larger cattle, phenotypically larger cattle, then you just background them and put them in the feedlot, and they fatten much quicker. So it'll be a win-win situation for everyone. And if we manage them under ultra-high density grazing, when we can carry double or triple the number of cattle, it's a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, we we've covered the point of fertility in a minor way. There has been a considerable shift in the fertility rate of cattle, and I was wondering if you could speak to that. What realities are unobserved in that?
Well, the reason for that is because we're selecting for individual performance and for larger cattle. And there's indirectly, if we're selecting for larger frame cattle, we're indirectly selecting for later maturing cattle. And that has a negative effect on, that's one reason that it has a negative effect on practical fertility. I talk about practical fertility, the fertility of cattle on the ranch. And the other reason for a lower practical fertility is inherently poor body condition because of our selection for larger cattle, larger frame.
Yes, sir. Well, was there a single turning point for the industry that led us here? Was there a single metric that came out and had such an influence that everybody made this about face and turned to breeding in this style?
I think the major turning point came when feedlots became important in the United States. That's where the major turning point came. Prior to that, cattle had to be grass efficient.
Okay. Well, is there any main driver that helped bring that to the everyman? There were people that benefited from a feedlot environment. Is there a reason that others would have continued to breed for that?
Well, I think everyone has a perception that you have to breed cattle that would fit into the feedlot situation. That is a particular case in South Africa, and I'm sure it's a case in the United States as well, where that perception is that you have to breed cattle that suit the feedlots. And if you do that, that's where the problem arises. You're breeding cattle that aren't grass adapted or grass
All
efficient.
right. Well, to speak in that regard further, how rare are truly functional cattle herds today?
Extremely rare. Within cattle herds, there are individual cattle, the individual animals that are still efficient, and that amazes me. I've traveled quite a bit around the world, and I've seen that. And in most herds, you will still find, fortunately, still find efficient cattle. But the trend is towards the less efficient cattle, less grass efficient cattle.
Yes,
Everywhere.
sir.
It's a worldwide, particularly in the so-called improved herds or improved breeds. You will only find the really efficient cattle in unimproved breeds, uh, African breeds, for instance, that are um, largely under the powers of natural selection and aggravated natural selection in the sense that those animals have to sleep in corrals at night, and they have a limited grazing time because they also have to are they used as draft animals as well. So the African cattle in particular are extremely efficient in terms of they survivors of a natural aggravated natural selection, whereas the cattle that the conventional cattle are actually survivors of or how can I put it, they survive of the prettiest, not survive of the fittest.
Yeah. Well, for someone who is not of a cattle background like myself, could you break down that concept of improved versus unimproved?
Well, improved would be fitting into the paradigms of the stud industry. In other words, they have to be registered, they have to be conform to certain performance metrics. They're the sort of what we call in inverted commas the improved animals. But the problem is then what we're doing at best in terms of our selection, performance selection, is we're breeding cattle that require better nutrition. That is where the problem arises. They require better nutrition in order to be so-called efficient.
Excellent. Well, to carry that point forward, you've written that body condition is a reflection of adaptation and efficiency. And,
Yes,
and
body
if that,
condition. Yes, sorry to interrupt you. Body condition would be a reflection of efficiency.
yes, sir. I'm
And
sorry.
efficiency would be determined by relative intake. In other words, it's intake relative to size. If you look at you look at the mammalian world, you look at elephant and you look at mice. An elephant have a very, very high intake, absolute intake. Mice have a very small intake, but relative to their size, the intake of mice is much larger than that of elephant. So their metabolism will be very different, and they'll mature much earlier. And you would find that between species of like sheep and cattle, the smaller sheep are much more efficient because of the smaller intake, larger relative intake rather. And within cattle herds as well, relative to size, the larger animals have a larger intake, but relative to their size, they have a lower intake. Whereas your smaller frame animals have a larger relative intake, which reflects in better body condition. And that results in higher fertility.
I like the way you speak on that too, and these natural restraints that we all are faced with. We all
Yeah.
have the natural restraint of a 24-hour day, and the amount
Yes,
of time in that can be based in consumption.
exactly.
And who operates the most efficiently within that 24-hour window? Who operates the most efficiently with their frame size and impact on natural environment?
So there's a requirement in terms of maintenance in terms of intake. So anything that goes above intake, above maintenance rather, goes into production. So the higher your relative intake is above maintenance, the higher the production is. And the smaller frame animals have a higher have a unfair advantage in terms of intake relative to the size. So they are more efficient under all
Thus,
circumstances. All
thus
circumstances.
allowing them to give more to their offspring as well.
Exactly,
Correct?
exactly. And in the end, which body condition is the end of the line, they have better body condition, and that results in higher fertility. So
So
fertility
it's
is,
the end of the line and the basis of all.
yes, that's right, yeah. So that
Excellent.
exactly. So the more there is left over at the end of the line, the more efficient that animal is going to be, and the higher the fertility will be.
Yes, sir. Well, just before we move on, I would like to speak about the reality of fertility and its loss in cattle herds and the way that many speak of its inheritable trait. What's your opinion in that regard? Is fertility heritable?
It's extremely highly irritable. The textbooks will tell you it's lowly irritable, and the professors at university will tell you it's lowly irritable. The problem is, how do you measure fertility? How do they measure fertility? If you measure fertility in terms of calving rate, it's very lowly. Calving rate is lowly irritable. But if you look at the determinants of fertility, the two major determinants are hormonal balance, that is highly irritable, and also inherent body condition, that is highly irritable. So if you have a measure of fertility that is genetically discernible, in other words, it reflects the inherent body condition and hormonal balance, that will be highly irritable. So one factor, from a practical point of view, if you have cows that calve at 2 years of age and they reconceive again to calve at 3 years of age, those animals will reflect a high irritability. And you will find that in any herd, there will be families that are much more fertile than others, and that reflects irritability, which is high, very high. How can a survival trait like fertility be lowly irritable? It's
Well
impossible.
said.
It can't be. It can't be. It's just the way we measure fertility. So that
Yes,
that
sir.
the measurement can be highly irritable or lowly irritable. But fertility in
Yeah.
itself is highly irritable.
Well, just so those listening in can recognize it, what does this level of reproduction failure actually look like in the real world? What repercussions are there of it?
Well, for
Beyond the one less calf each season.
Well, it's two things really. One is economically, obviously, that's an obvious negative aspect of it. The other one is that you're going to have over a period of say 100 years, you'll have lower generations. Your generation interval will be much lower. So if a cow calves at 2 years of age and calves every year, when she's 10 years old, her progeny already 3 generations ahead of her. If she calves at 3 years and calves every year, she'll only be at the second generation.
So, from what
Is
I hear, we
the
might be
gen-
feeling those effects in our national herds being at lower numbers at this point.
that will be one of the things, and also genetically, you're a lower generation because of the fact that your generation interval is so much longer, and when you're calving at an older age, and you don't calve, cows aren't producing calf every single year.
Yes, sir. So, one of the first things to suffer would be your herd's long-term sustainability and not only profit, but and the ability to carry on for another generation of ranchers.
That's right, yes, and also the effects, the reasons why the low fertility is poorer. One of the main reasons is inherent body condition. So you'll have to feed them more because the inherent body condition is lower. So you'll have to make up that with either selective grazing or selective grazing and higher feed inputs.
Yeah. So, yet another negative side effect of our reliance of inputs.
Exactly, yes.
Well, how could we push back against this current incentive structure and current way of breeding and building cattle?
Well, the first thing we have to understand is that cattle have a dual role. Very important to understand that. The one role is obviously cattle have to uh, be efficient grass converters and make us money, whether it's milk or beef or whatever the case may be. So they have to be efficient grass converters. The second one is we have to use those cattle to improve the land. In other words, we have to manage them in a way that we can increase our stocking rates and improve the grazing. And
Yes, sir.
the other point that's very important is that we have to have a complete paradigm change in terms of what we want. What is our goal? What is our objective? Our goal should be maximum sustainable profit per hectare and not production or profit per animal itself. If we have a goal of production per animal, as is currently the case, there's no ways we can improve our land. It's impossible because we have to graze our cattle selectively to be able to achieve that goal.
Okay. And so that and utilizing cattle as a tool of the land,
Exactly.
we increase the sustainability and the long-term uh, reward of our land in that regard.
And we're carrying many more cattle. 2, 3, 4, 5 times the number of cattle can be carried. There's
Really,
no doubt about that. Absolutely. I quadrupled my stocking rate over a period of 7 years by grazing them non-selectively. And I've seen it,
that affects the bottom line.
yeah, absolutely, and I've seen it, in other parts of the world as well, particularly a lot of people in Mexico that are grazing, appropriately. They've doubled or trebled their stocking rates already in a period of 10 years that I've been involved there. So that's it. If you have 2 or 3 times the number of cattle, even if each animal is producing less, your total production, because your biggest capital investment in most countries is the land itself. If you look at the value of land in America, you look at Texas, for instance, the value of land in Texas and what that land looks like now compared to what it looked like 100 years ago is a very high capital investment with a very poor return. So you need more animals, even if each animal is producing less per animal. Your total return on your capital is going to be much, much higher.
It sounds like a mixed diagnosis whenever problems are finally noticed.
Yeah.
We we look back as a herd and the property as a whole, and we treat the two independently. My
Yes,
land is
exactly.
failing me in this regard, and my cattle
Yeah.
are failing me in this regard.
Because of you.
Excellent.
You're the
Well,
problem. The book that I wrote is Man, Cattle, and Veld. Man,
yes,
cattle,
sir.
and Veld. Veld is grazing, pasture, or whatever grazing. But the biggest problem is man.
Yep.
Man has to create the mutually beneficial relationship between cattle and grass. And
Yes,
that we
sir.
can do through management and breeding, yeah.
Well, your book actually inspired my ending question for every one of my podcasts. I ask everybody what our moral obligation is to the land, the cattle, and
Yes.
future generations.
And we do have a moral obligation that's very important to understand that. It's very
Yes,
important.
sir.
But if we manage the cattle, the land in a way that is sustainable for the current and succeeding populations, or our children and grandchildren, we will be rewarded for that. We're rewarded financially and with better land,
Yeah.
better quality
Well,
grazing,
and
better
we
everything.
yeah, and we owe it to the cattle themselves too. Why would
Yeah,
we raise them to fail?
exactly. Yes. Exactly. It's that mutually beneficial. That is what I say. One of the main things we have to understand is that cattle have a dual role. One is land improvement, and one is efficiently converting grass into a saleable product.
Yes, sir. Well, to round back to our conversation of raising cattle in a natural environment, when we challenge science, is it the fact that we're simply measuring what is observational versus what is easiest from a classroom environment or a on high? Do you think that's what it comes from?
We're not challenging science. I would say we're challenging pseudoscience. What we call
There you
science
go.
today, a lot of it is pseudoscience. It's not science. If we're really interested in understanding science, we have to get back into the natural environment. That is where we see how nature works and how natural processes work. That's true science. And if we understand that, then we understand that our role as cattle breeders or cattlemen, is to firstly accelerate the process of natural selection. In other words, we have to allow the nature or the environment to select the cattle for us. We just have to read that correctly. In other words, the nature will tell us which are the better cattle, which are the more efficient cattle, and we accelerate that process. That is one of our roles. The other role is very important as well, is we have to enhance natural processes. And we do that by managing cattle in a way that they improve the effectiveness of rainfall, improve soil fertility, improve plant composition, improve our utilization of solar energy, etc., etc. That's our role. Simple.
Yes, sir. Well, you spent decades working across different countries and systems. What patterns do you see continue to repeat?
Well, what I do see now, and luckily, is that there's a definite movement in the right direction. When I say right direction, and using cattle, breeding them to efficiently convert grass, and using to improve the land. And I've seen that particularly in the Latin countries, Latin America, South America, uh, and parts of the United States as well. But particularly in the Latin countries, for some reason, those people are very open to uh, new ideas and open to uh, they're looking for answers to improve their land and their cattle.
Okay. And what would you say that looks like? If you were to describe that shift, what's their starting point and what opened their eyes?
I'm not exactly sure. I think what opened a lot of people's eyes is the land degradation and also the type of cattle that we had. I think if I can speak from the personal experience I've had with ranchers in Mexico, for instance, is that they were looking for answers. They could see that their land was deteriorating. You know, if you look at it from year to year, it's not so. It's an insidious deterioration. But if you look at from generation to generation, you see there's a massive degradation of the land, and I think people are becoming to understand that. And also, with the cattle, we've gone the wrong direction. We've gone in two opposite directions. The cattle that we require to improve the land, we haven't been breeding. We've been breeding cattle that require extra inputs just to stay alive and be productive. Never mind to use them as a tool to improve the land. So I think that people are becoming starting to understand that.
So Were these more systemic issues or were there far more isolated cases?
They were initially, they were very isolated. You know, when I look back 30 years ago, I was virtually on my own. But people since then, I think, you know, it's taken on a movement that you won't stop. It's just gathering in momentum.
Yes, sir. Well, and speaking about these people opening their eyes and wanting to make a difference, and the first thing they're noticing is their environment failing. It sounds like a lot of this improvement needs to be based in observation first.
Absolutely.
And some of those tools of observation, yeah, do some of them fail us even now as we I feel like we have a larger arsenal than ever to have an understanding of our cattle and our environment, but I feel like many tools lead us astray or in a wrong direction. Do any come to mind when I make that statement?
Well, what I can say is that the tools to improve the land and the cattle are very, 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 very simple. The biggest paradigm shift, I think, what we have to go through is to understand that cattle have a dual role, and that we have to use them to attain maximum profit per hectare. I think I don't know whether I'm answering your question correctly, but if people focus on that, then it'll lead them into the right direction. And one of the challenges is to keep everything simple. We try and
Yeah.
complicate matters. It's a very, very simple. To accelerate natural selection is very simple. To enhance natural processes is very simple. By enhancing natural processes, I mean by helping them along, natural processes, not substituting them with chemicals and fertilizers and feed. That's a substitution, not an enhancement.
Yeah. What I was alluding to in my last question, and I promise it wasn't a trick question, is can use of EPDs or other metrics lead an operation astray?
Absolutely. Just to think about EPDs, you've already gone astray. Absolutely. I mean, it's so simple. How can we, the problem is um, if we take too many measurements and we look at detail, how do we put that detail together? There's no man alive today who can put all that detail that's available back into a meaningful way. But if we select for rather than looking for detail and trying to select a productive animal, we just have to identify a productive animal and select from him. So we select for an outcome and not for a wishful outcome, but an actual outcome. That's what we should concentrate on. So EPDs absolutely lead us astray. Definitely. There's no doubt about
So
that.
I need to view it as a whole rather than this narrow view of what I view as a
Yes, you see, with
victory.
EPDs, if EPDs are accurate, and I question that, if they are accurate, it means that you're increasing the accuracy of an inappropriate criteria. Now, how clever is that? That's what we're doing. So
Yeah.
the criteria we're using, that's what we should focus on, whether they're appropriate or not.
Yes, sir. Well, sir, we've covered quite a bit. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd like to speak on that you would hope a message the listeners could carry away today?
Well, at the moment, I can't, off my head, I can't think, Patrick. Um, I think if I had to leave a message behind, it's a very simple message, very simple, is that we have to change our goal to maximum sustainable profit, ecologically and economically sustainable. And if we have that as a goal, then all our breeding and management practices will be different.
Okay. Well, would you mind if I asked you to paint that whole picture in its entirety for me? If tomorrow morning you wake up and walk outside and everybody is shifted to maximizing profit per acre or per hectare, and that is reflected in their cattle breeding, what does that look like?
We'll probably have too many cattle. Cattle prices will come down, but everyone will be happy, and the land will improve. And I can't think of a better scenario. We
Yeah.
wouldn't, even if feedlotting is a profitable enterprise, it's not counterproductive to have very effective and efficient cattle. We just have to feed them for a shorter period if we have to feed them. Most of them we can fatten off the grass or grass plus supplement. So everyone will be in a better situation. The feedlots will have 2 or 3 times more cattle than they can fattle on the same amount of feed. And
So
the
even in
producer,
this
so
even in
the,
this imaginary world where we wake up tomorrow and everything we're speaking of today is implemented, a feedlot exists and there's a place and a time for it.
well, if there's a place and time for it, it's not a problem at all. Everyone will benefit. Even the consumer will benefit because the price will be lower because we'll be able to produce everything more efficiently. We'll
Yes,
be
sir.
more profitable, and the consumer will uh, buy less for healthier beef.
Yeah.
Everyone will
Well, in an
benefit.
effort to make this sound more accessible and not as grand, what would be some baby steps you would recommend a small producer like myself, if I were to try and implement my maximization of financial reward per acre rather than per cow? What would be some of my first steps?
I would think steps or stats. Steps. You're talking about
Yes,
steps?
sir.
Steps. Okay.
Yeah. How would I go about this?
Well, the first step would be to increase cattle numbers. And that you can do very easily by managing them appropriately, grazing them appropriately, under ultra-high density grazing. As many cattle as possible, on the smallest piece of land possible, for the shortest time possible, doing the severest grazing possible and the severest trampling possible with an appropriate recovery time. And by appropriate recovery time, I mean appropriate for the grass and, depending on environment, appropriate for the cattle as well in terms of nutrition. It's so simple.
All right.
And so
I was
even
expecting so.
even with the lower production per animal, and then of course, then in the longer term, you could look at the type of animal you have, the genotype. But I would think the first step would be to increase cattle numbers. Even with a lower production per animal, you're going to improve your land and you're going to make more money. And if you have to feed more, it'll be far more effective than doing that same amount of feeding or same feeding principles at lower density, lower stock density, lower stock numbers.
Well, a minor shift in our conversation. You're working alongside with Boss Sires,
Yes.
and some of the cattle listed there have the Zietsman stamp of approval.
Yes, that's true.
Could you tell me exactly what that represents?
Well, the way I look at an animal, if I look at a bull, the fullest package to me means that bull, uh, because if you have animals of different size, which you will find in any herd, the animal that's grown fastest relative to its size, in other words, has had the highest relative intake, will be the most efficient. And the animal that's grown fastest relative to its size will be a shorter in stature and much beefier. It'll carry much more meat. So it'll be a fuller package. If I can use that as an analogy, the package of sugar. If you have a 10-kilogram package of sugar and you've got 9 kilograms of sugar in it, the animal will be bigger. But if you have a 5-kilogram package of sugar and you've got 8 kilograms in it, that animal is bursting at the seams. And that, in my sense, in my way of thinking, that would be the far better animal. So it's a shorter stature, but heavier. Shorter, smaller, and heavier, the better.
Well, what do you hope to achieve with your collaborative work with Boss Sires?
Well, I just hope that people will understand that those are the sort of animals that we need to use. If you look at the Brahmin, for instance, the early Brahmins of the 70, 80 years ago looked very, very different to what they look like now. And in fact, the Baron breed from Africa, which is also a zebra breed, but it's very similar to the Brahmin in many senses, is still unimproved to a large degree. And they look very different. They look more like the 80 year, 1950s, 1940 type Brahmins. So we have to rewind very quickly.
I like it. I like it. Well, sir, was there one thing that allowed you to easily align yourself with Boss Sires, or were there many principles in action that made it sound like the right fit?
Could you repeat that again, Patrick? I didn't quite.
Yes, sir. Given everything you've seen, why have you chosen to align yourself with Boss Sires?
Well, we have the same. I believe we have the same objective. Is to breed more efficient cattle.
Excellent.
I'm very happy to be aligned with you, And in terms of, we just have to find more breeders, like-minded breeders, and communicate better to the cattlemen so they understand what we've got available. And that will have a very, very big impact worldwide if we can do that, particularly because of the fact that we can use semen worldwide.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, much of what we've talked about today is the current condition of cattle, the current breeding practices, and our current utilization of the land. We've talked about how easily an individual can win this fight, if you would consider it a fight. How reversible are many of these problems we spoke of today? Is this something realized in a generation?
Absolutely. I think in one generation we can change our cattle. In a period of 5 years, we can change cattle, particularly if we utilize different breeds to form our own composites, which I would recommend. And also, in terms of the grazing side, we can do that virtually overnight. So within a period of 5 to 10 years, we can change the whole. We can change it to where everyone is getting. Will be able to carry 2 or 3 times the number of cattle they're carrying at the moment that are far more efficient.
I was hoping at some point today you would speak to the power of composites. I know that you're a fan of building composite breeds.
Absolutely, it's the quickest way to breed the genotype that's required or adapted to, or more efficient in your own environment. It's a very, very quick. And what I would say then, what is important is to combine the right breeds for your environment. And more important than that is to select the right individuals within those breeds. And even more important than that is then your selection program in a closed herd after that, using the right selection criteria. So important is the right breeds. More important is the individuals within the breeds, because they vary so much, and also the selection that takes place after that.
And did you just remark that once you think you've got it there, close it off and just breed among that?
I would say close, in inverted commas, close off, yes. And what you're actually doing is you line breeding or inbreeding, call it what you like. That's important. So we increasing the number of the right type of genes within our herd. Later on, we all make mistakes, and other opportunities might come along. We have other breeds, like that one breed in China that I'm very interested in. It's extremely productive breed in China. If along the line we find we're lacking in something, we can always bring some other genetics into a closed herd and close it and keep it and close it again. So closed within inverted commas, I'd say, yes.
Perfect. Well, we touched on it earlier, but what would you tell a young producer starting today if they were just gaining their footing and taking a look at the industry as a whole? Would it be a message of hope, a message of caution? How would you address a young producer starting out?
Well, if we want to go down the conventional route, it's disaster. But there is a better option, and that there's a lot of hope in any young producer if he chooses the right route. If he chooses a regenerative route, and regenerating our land and regenerating our genetics, I would say there's a lot of optimism in that. Definitely.
Excellent.
And a short period of time as well. It doesn't have to take long. 5 to 10
Excellent.
years. Yeah.
Well, sir, I know we're getting close to the end of this. I don't have much more in front of me to ask of you today, but we spoke earlier about my question, and I would like to give you an opportunity to answer it individually. In your view, what is the moral obligation of the cattleman or the herdsman to the land, the cattle, and future generations?
Very simple. We have to accelerate natural selection and enhance natural processes. That's all. That's our obligation.
Everything else will fall in place, huh?
Everything else will fall in place. And keep it simple. Don't complicate matters. It's very, very simple. We have to allow nature to, and we have to observe. We have to be very observant. And that's when I say accelerate natural selection, we have to read nature correctly. Nature will tell us which are the right animals. That would be my
I think
message.
that'd be the best tool in your arsenal is understanding how to read nature.
Yes, observe.
Excellent. Well, sir, I hope this isn't our only time visiting for the podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you today. Maybe next time we can get into a little bit more of academia, associations, and stuff like that. Would you be willing to come back on and dive deeper into individual conversations?
No, I'd be very happy to do that, and it's been my pleasure talking to you, Patrick.
Yes, sir. Well, I like to invite all my guests to help me sign out. So, with that, I'd like to say, don't forget to ranch with purpose.
And breed and manage for the future.
Thanks for listening to Sustainable Stock. If this episode gave you a deeper appreciation for the people, the land, and the cattle behind your beef, like, subscribe, and share it. For full video episodes, follow us on YouTube. This show is brought to you by Boss Sires Genetics, your source for functional, fertile, adapted genetics. Until next time, stay rooted in common sense and connected to the herd.